Hi, I'm Dr. Lisa Portland, your host for Conversations in Sustainability, a regular podcast that explores the most pressing ESG, environmental, social and governance challenges facing Australia and the world. Produced by Green Horizon, specialist sustainability arm of Sydney-based communications agency Horizon Communication Group, the podcast cuts through the complexity to uncover the real stories shaping our sustainable future. Each episode dives into vital topics such as sustainable seafood, modern slavery, Australia's electric vehicle transition, and nature-positive business, plus many more. Featuring thought leaders and change makers from business, government, academia, and the not-for-profit sector, Conversations in Sustainability delivers practical, actionable insights that inspire and inform. Tim Whiddon is the Executive Manager of Strategic Communications for the Office of the eSafety Commissioner, the world's first government online safety regulator. Tim's interest in the intersection of technology, society and policy led him to eSafety following a career specialising in sensitive and contentious issues in the government context. He leads the agency's efforts to enhance public awareness and education on issues of online harms, as well as using communication tools to support eSafety's regulatory functions by influencing the technology sector to strive for better outcomes for Australians. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We're very excited to have you on the podcast today. And I guess to kick things off, tell us a bit around what is the remit of the eSafety Commissioner within the eSafety domain?
Well, it's pretty multifaceted. I've been at eSafety for coming up to 2 years now, and I'm still discovering initiatives that are going on around the place. But like all good communications people, we like to have a mnemonic to remember things. So for us, it's the 3 Ps. Yes. So the first P is prevention. Mm-hmm. That was really eSafety's genesis we've just had our 10-year anniversary, and in the earliest days, prevention was really the key focus. And that's largely driven by education efforts. So one of our branches, Education, Prevention and Inclusion, we do a lot of work with schools, webinars for parents. Our website is a really good resource. I think a lot of government websites are very bureaucratic. You might find the org chart, who's who, the mission statement and some contact information, but eSafety's website is really vast, and I think of it as a product. So it's an excellent resource for that education piece. So that's the prevention. The second P is protection, yes. And that's where our reporting schemes come in. As you noted in your kind introduction, eSafety was the world's first online regulator. We've been joined by a number of other countries now as well. There's become a bit of a groundswell in the last decade. But what's unique to eSafety is these reporting schemes, and we have 4. There's the illegal and restricted content scheme, and that's all about like the worst of the worst. You've got child sexual abuse material, terrorist, violent, extremist content. People, if they find it, can report to us, and we are empowered under the law to take action and force the platforms basically to remove that kind of content. So that became a really important thing after, say, the Christchurch shooting, terrorist manifestos, and of course, child sexual abuse material, which is far more prolific, I think, than the average person thinks. We've got the image-based abuse scheme, colloquially known as revenge porn. We don't use that language. It's doubly problematic, I think. Revenge for what? And even the word porn implies consensual activity, which, this is the antithesis of that. So, if someone's nudes have been shared online, we've got power to have those taken down, and we've got a blistering success rates well over 90%, which is great. And then you've got the cyberbullying scheme, which is focused on children, and the sort of sister scheme to that is the adult cyber abuse scheme, which has a deliberately high threshold because when the legislation was made, they're very conscious about making sure that it was balancing other rights like your freedom to express yourself. But it's also, it's an excellent protective measure if you are experiencing, hateful abuse online.
Yes.
You can jump on the eSafety website, hit the report button, the report comes through to us and we'll take action. The third P is proactive and systemic change, which I think is my favourite one. That's about really leaning on industry to build in the safeguards that really should be there. I think for a long time the internet was a bit of a Wild West, and we refer a lot to safety by design. So it could be compared to a car. Cars back in the day, they didn't have seat belts, airbags, collapsible steering columns, crumple zones. But that's something that we now expect as a standard thing.
Yeah.
So safety by design is all about building these guardrails in rather than bolting them on as an afterthought. So we can use a lot of our influence there, and that's where my branch, the communications branch, can really help as well, because these are pretty powerful companies. And while our powers, involve fines in certain circumstances, millions of dollars might be pocket change to some of these companies, but they care about their reputation. So we use transparency powers, these sorts of things, to really show, if it's not a priority for you, well, then you should say so. So the proactive and systemic change is a really important piece of the puzzle too. So as I say, it's a very multifaceted approach.
Fascinating stuff. And so every time I talk to you, Tim, I feel like, I do get the sense that the internet is the Wild West, and that it is shifting at a pace, right, in terms of those guardrails that you were talking about. But what are some of the key concerns at the moment in the eSafety arena?
Well, we get quite a lot of intelligence in the world, in the work that we do, that otherwise could be, not very transparent. You don't always know what's going on behind the closed doors of these large companies. There's a couple of ways we do that. We've got a research arm, so there's a lot of data-driven decision-making happening, and we also have what's called the basic online safety expectations, under which we can issue platforms with notices basically telling us you need to report to us on a series of questions. Say how many trust and safety staff you have, how long you take to respond to complaints, these kinds of things. And what all of this information tells us is that I think any reasonable person would agree the platforms, they just aren't doing enough around online safety in this kind of regard. Now, I think there's a bit of a legacy here. I think it would be coming up to 35 years, I believe, that the Communications Decency Act was passed in the United States, and that's the birthplace of the internet for all intents and purposes. And Section 230 of the Act basically said online companies are not publishers, and they can't be held accountable for things that their users say and do. Now, that has sort of given industry a free pass, and it's been a wonderful thing in many ways. But that free pass also, I think, is really coming home to roost as technology advances. And so I think that's where the role of online regulators really come in, because when you think about it, these companies, they're not run by evil people, but they're beholden to shareholders. So we need to create a level playing field and say, hey, these are the regulations, this is what's expected of you. Because if I were a leader of a major tech platform and I decided altruistically that I wanted to make the space safer, divert resources into doing so, perhaps kick off bad actors or people who are young and impressionable, then I'm going to be leaving money on the table for my shareholders, and I'm not going to be around for very long. If you create this regulatory environment where there is a level playing field, understood expectations, then that's where we can start to see some change. And, it's by nature sometimes an adversarial relationship with the platforms, but it's also often very cordial. They want the same things too, the people that run these companies. They want to leave a good legacy. So I think it's important work. But at this particular point in time, they're not doing nothing, but they're not doing enough.
Right, okay. And so there's been a lot of talk about this new legislation, which has been passed in Australia. Indeed. Around young people and the impact, I guess, for young people from a social media perspective in Australia, but also in terms of Australia leading the way internationally. What is the impact of this new legislation for young people and social media?
Well, you're right about that. The world is watching, as I'm reminded frequently. It's new territory. The mechanics of it is that obviously it's passed by an act of parliament. It had bipartisan support, as well as I think a real groundswell of community support. There was the 36 Months campaign and others. I think a lot of it was driven by the New York academic Jonathan Haidt, who literally wrote the book on this stuff, The Anxious Generation, which is worth a look. So it's passed by an act of parliament, but it's eSafety's role to enforce the act. There's a couple of myths about it. One thing to make really clear, no parent, no child will be punished for being on a social media platform. The point of the legislation really is to put the onus on the platforms. And we know it's not going to be perfect, right? The requirement for the platforms is that they take reasonable steps to ensure that people under the age of 16 aren't on the platforms. Of course we know, and the Prime Minister's compared it to, we know some under 18s get their hands on alcohol. But is it better than nothing? Yes, I think it is, even if it's not perfect. We really think of it as a public health issue. The Commissioner doesn't refer to it as a ban. I think it's a good reframing to talk about it as a delay. We know these are developing brains. They're vulnerable at that age. And just keeping them off the platforms for an extra few years gives them time to develop that resilience and those skills to be a bit more ready. We talk about comparing it to water safety. We don't try and fence the ocean. We know that that's unfeasible. So what do? We teach children water safety, teach them what the dangers are, how to interact with it safely. We put lifeguards on beaches. We swim between the flags, all these sorts of things. So it's another tool in the toolkit. And it's also been designed to be balanced with a number of other digital rights that we firmly believe children have. There's always a balance to be had in their right to participate, their right to privacy, their right to dignity, but also their right to be free of harm.
Yes,
so I think it's a positive step in the right direction.
Okay, so as a mother, we often don't know exactly what's going on within, the online domain with our kids and how exactly to ensure their privacy. How can parents and guardians stay informed and involved without violating their child's online privacy?
Yeah, I get asked this a lot, especially at barbecues when people find out what I do for a living.
Yes.
I have children too. I think about this a lot. They're not at this stage yet. They're very young. But the thing I always say is talk to your kids, some honest communication and ongoing communication, I think, is the most important thing. In terms of privacy, we all know children, as they get older, have an increasing right and an increasing demand for privacy, but you've got to do what's age appropriate. The key thing, I think, is to have those honest conversations. So, for example, when my children are of that age, there'll be some clear boundaries set. And I think one of the most important ones is if you've got a phone, you do not take it to your bedroom, right? It should not be used in a private space. I imagine some of your listeners, I don't know if you have seen the miniseries Adolescence, which was absolutely brilliant. And I think, a real eye-opener for people in the dangers of what can happen behind closed doors. The way algorithms work, you can really send kids down a rabbit hole, and that's just one of many dangers. So using it in the public space, the public area of the home, the shared area, I think is a really good boundary to draw. I think of, back when I was a child and we had a landline that you couldn't walk away into another room. Was my privacy being violated when I spoke to my friends on the phone then? I don't think so. So I think an appropriate boundary like that. And the other thing I'll be telling my children is when you have a phone, at least in the early days, you actually don't have a right to it being totally private. And we'll be doing spot checks. I want to check in on you, who you're messaging, those sorts of things, so that they're aware of that. I don't think it's a good idea to do that without the kid knowing. I think it should be an open thing. The expectation that, anything I do, my parents might find out about. I think that's how you do check in. You might not be checking everything, but you'll make sure that you're catching things if they start to worry you. In the same way that if the school rings and says your son's been bullying another child, you take action. I think that's where you look for those red flags. Look, one of the things that does concern me about the Social Media Minimum Age Act and its implementation is that some parents might think, oh, good, that issue's dealt with for me now. I don't have to think about this stuff anymore. As I said before, it's not going to be a perfect catch-all. We know it's not a silver bullet.
Yes.
And I'd really encourage parents to be engaged. You can visit our website. We've got tons of resources on how to have these conversations with your kids. I know for a lot of parents, it all seems Greek because the technology moves so fast. I mean, some of the apps that I read about on our own eSafety guide, I feel 100 years old because I've never heard of them. But there's a wealth of information there on what's available, and also how to have those conversations in a constructive and productive way. So I'd really encourage people to come and have a look at the site.
Fantastic. Okay, so in terms of emerging technologies and their potential impact on e-safety, you just mentioned just then, Tim, there's a proliferation of different platforms that are coming up at the moment, but also AI is constantly in the conversation. What kind of impact are these emerging technologies having on e-safety?
Well, look, AI it's the doyen of them all. You'd have to be blind not to see how fast that's moved on. I think my 2-year-old is about the same age as ChatGPT, and now it's so embedded in our lives. And look, I think it's a really important thing. The theme with so much of the stuff we do is that the internet is great and sometimes awful. And the big one that's really caught our attention is deep fake image-based abuse.
Yes.
That's a real challenge. We've seen a doubling in the last 18 months of instances of this. It seems you can't go a month without seeing a school pulled into a scandal. Teenagers who should know better, but they don't, doing these kinds of things. And it can really destroy lives. It's also being used to turbocharge sexual extortion, which is horrific. Sexual extortion, I've got to say for anyone listening, please talk to your kids, especially your sons, about sexual extortion. You've got these situations where the young man has met somebody online in the morning and has taken some drastic action that afternoon. It's absolutely horrific. And my message to people is, first of all, don't pay. Do not pay a cent. They're just going to come back for more. Secondly, tell someone you trust, whether it's your mum or your dad or a school teacher, any adult. Just tell someone you trust, take that burden off your shoulders, and then come to our website, save the evidence, and then block. So take your screenshots and then block. And then come to our website, hit the report button, and we can give you advice. We can't necessarily catch the perpetrators. These are usually, almost always, organised crime syndicates on the other side of the planet. We're not going to arrest our way out of this situation. We're not going to regulate our way out of this situation. We can educate our way out of this situation. And my dream is that, when you get one of those emails, says, I'm the prince of a certain country and, you're entitled to millions of dollars, just send us your bank account details. And you see that email and you think, yeah, nice try. That's what I want to happen with sexual extortion, is that we teach young people that, look for the red flag. Is this too good to be true? And just make smart choices around that. Sexual extortion, deepfake AI, there's something new every year, but those are the ones that we're really focused on at the moment.
Okay. So we chatted a little around the new legislation here in Australia. How effective are current national and international laws in addressing online abuse and exploitation?
Well, it's not perfect, but in relative terms, it's pretty early days. And I think we're making good progress. Being the first regulator in the world, we were on a lonely precipice for quite some time.
Yes.
And now we've got quite a few friends. There's a lot of nations that have followed suit. eSafety was the co-founder of GOSRN, the Global Online Regulators Network, which brings about some cohesion, which is really important. We work very closely with some NGOs, and we have MOUs with other countries that aren't members of this GOSRN. But coherence is really important because the internet is locationless. So you've got this sort of jurisdictional challenge. Most of the big tech platforms are located in the United States. So we need to have some sort of coherence. And different countries are taking different approaches, but there's a lot of information sharing, idea sharing that's going on. And I think the platforms do know that we are on the precipice of change. The wagons are circling, regulation is coming, and that, we need to see improvements. I think it's become much more a social issue writ large. People are paying a lot more attention. I think if we were having this conversation 10 years ago, someone might be tempted to say, well, sticks and stones will break my bones. But there is real harm going on in all kinds of different ways. And if, as a platform, you are making millions or billions of dollars from your user base, then you also have a social responsibility to that user base to make things safer and make sure people are having better experiences online. So I think we're getting stronger every year globally in terms of that coherence, in terms of that effectiveness. And not to get too lofty, but I'm reminded of the Martin Luther King quote that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And I think we're heading in that direction.
You mentioned a little bit earlier on adolescents, who a lot of people have watched and I guess has had a big impact on how people are thinking about algorithms and the use of social media from their children. How do algorithms contribute to the spread of harmful content, and how can this be mitigated?
This is the trouble, because it can be quite insidious because they're so invisible. But yes, it's a challenge. Look, I sometimes have nostalgia for the good old days, being, circa 2007, where you'd look at your Facebook feed. It was filled with your friends. There was no endless scroll. You'd actually reach the bottom and you caught up. Whereas now you do have these features like endless scroll, which is a challenge in itself, especially for young people, in terms of their own ability to self-regulate. But algorithms, the trouble there is the platforms have so much data on you that they know what is going to make you stick around. We refer to the platforms wanting to be sticky. They want you to be on the platform for as long as possible. Now, what's the best way to do that? Well, you show things that are controversial and stimulating and extreme. And I've seen the experiment done where someone will sign up a brand new, fresh account, give it a minimal amount of information and just start scrolling. And before you know it, you might be down a misogynist rabbit hole or some other, eating disorders, these kinds of things, because the priority is to keep people on platform. So I suppose in that regard, as I said earlier, we need to incentivize platforms to do the right thing or disincentivize doing the wrong thing so that it's commercially viable for them to make better choices. But you've got to ask yourself, what are your values? Do we think it's okay that people, especially children, are being exposed to more and more extreme content, being driven down rabbit holes? I think it's bad for social cohesion. We're seeing people going down conspiracy theory holes. And the algorithms will adapt to the user because they do have so much information. I mean, if you compare it to, the days of print news, the newspapers had exactly one metric. How many newspapers did we sell this time? They didn't know which stories were getting the most eyeballs, which ones, how long people spent reading each story. Now that they're online, they do have that kind of thing. But in terms of, say, endless scroll of videos, that's where I think things can get to a really extreme and dangerous place. And that does concern me, especially with young people.
Okay, Tim, well, that's been such a fascinating conversation that I'm sure a lot of our listeners will be interested in. I guess if you wanted to leave our listeners with one call to action around eSafety, what would it be?
Well, I'll end where I started, education. I think that's the most important thing. I think a lot of this stuff seems really opaque to people.
Yes.
So educate yourself, educate your kids, come visit the website. It's not all doom and gloom. There are solutions. Come and have a look at the resources. And if you're in trouble, get in touch with us.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tim.
Thanks, Lisa.
You've been listening to Conversations in Sustainability, a podcast by the Green Horizon team. We're specialists in sustainability communications, from the circular economy to the energy transition and food waste to electric vehicles. We live and breathe these issues day in, day out. To check out our work and hear from some of our clients, head to greenhorizon.au.